Why are good, patient, and dedicated men being systematically poisoned within their own relationships? Why are those who try hardest to love and understand exactly the ones suffering the most devastating psychological transformations? Carl Jung discovered something shocking. There exists a hidden, unconscious pattern that is literally poisoning the masculine mind. We're not talking about physical poison, but something far more subtle and dangerous. A psychological poison that slowly corrodes the essence of genuinely good men. Through decades of study, Jung identified specific behaviors that function as emotional toxins, infiltrating the masculine psyche and transforming patience into rage, love into resentment, and kindness into bitterness. The most disturbing part: this happens completely unconsciously. Millions of men around the world are being poisoned at this very moment without even realizing it. They feel the symptoms, the growing irritability, hopelessness, inexplicable anger, but cannot identify the source. Prepare yourself for a revelation that will forever change your perception of relationships. What you're about to discover may be disturbing, but it's the only way to stop this silent poisoning that is destroying good men. 1. The hidden shadow. How male patience creates a time bomb. Every man carries within him what Jung called the shadow, the dark, repressed parts of his personality that he refuses to acknowledge. When a man chooses to be patient, kind, and understanding, he's not eliminating his shadow, he's simply pushing it deeper into his unconscious mind. This creates a dangerous psychological pressure cooker that will eventually explode. The patient man believes he's being virtuous by suppressing his anger, frustration, and natural assertiveness. He swallows harsh words, ignores disrespectful behavior, and constantly makes excuses for actions that would trigger immediate responses in other men. He tells himself this makes him better, more evolved, more loving. But Jung understood that this suppression comes at a terrible cost. What happens is that all these unexpressed emotions don't disappear. They accumulate in the shadow like psychological poison. Each time he chooses silence over confrontation, each moment he accepts unacceptable behavior, each instance where he prioritizes peace over his own dignity, he feeds this dark reservoir growing inside him. The shadow operates by different rules than conscious mind. While the conscious self preaches patience and understanding, the shadow keeps a detailed record of every slight, every disrespect, every moment where his boundaries were crossed. It remembers everything, and it's building towards something explosive. Women often mistake this patience for weakness or unlimited tolerance. They push boundaries further, testing how much this good man will accept before he finally stands up for himself. But they don't realize they're not dealing with weakness. They're dealing with a man who has temporarily disconnected from a fundamental part of his nature. The patient man becomes increasingly disconnected from his authentic feelings. He loses touch with his instincts, his natural responses, and even his ability to recognize when he's being mistreated. This disconnection makes him vulnerable to manipulation and psychological abuse, because he's no longer listening to the internal warning systems that would protect him. Jung observed that men who suppress their shadow for extended periods often experience what he called enantiodromia, a sudden reversal where the suppressed opposite emerges with tremendous force. The patient man doesn't just get a little angry. He explodes with years of accumulated rage that shocks everyone around him, including himself. The tragedy is that this explosion destroys not only the relationship, but often the man's self-image. He sees himself as someone who lost control, rather than understanding that he was systematically poisoned by his own virtue. He feels guilt and shame for expressing emotions that were completely natural responses to unacceptable treatment. This pattern repeats because society teaches men that anger is always wrong, that patience is always virtuous, and that good men should be able to tolerate anything. But Jung knew that emotions exist for a reason. They're information systems that tell us when something is wrong. When we consistently ignore this information, we create psychological dysfunction. The patient man must learn that boundaries aren't walls built in anger. They're healthy limits that prevent the accumulation of poison in his psyche. True strength lies not in endless tolerance, but in the ability to address problems before they become explosive. The shadow will have its day. The only choice is whether that day comes as healthy assertiveness or destructive rage. 2. The silent control game. When she tests his limits. Women possess an instinctual understanding of psychological territory that most men never fully grasp. They intuitively know how to map the emotional landscape of relationships, finding every boundary, every limit, and every point of resistance. What appears as random behavior is often a sophisticated testing system designed to understand exactly how much control they can establish. This testing doesn't happen through direct confrontation. That would be too obvious and might trigger immediate pushback. Instead, it operates through a series of small, seemingly innocent probes that gradually expand the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Each successful test moves the line a little further, establishing new territories of influence and control. The process begins subtly. She might interrupt him mid-sentence to see if he'll assert his right to finish his thought. She'll make plans without consulting him to test whether he'll demand to be included in decisions affecting him. She'll dismiss his opinions in social settings to see if he'll defend his perspective or simply accept being diminished. When the patient man fails these tests by choosing harmony over self-respect, he unknowingly signals that his boundaries are negotiable. This creates a psychological dynamic where respect becomes conditional rather than automatic. The woman begins to lose attraction to someone who won't defend his own dignity, while simultaneously losing respect for someone who allows himself to be diminished. Jung understood that power dynamics in relationships are largely unconscious. The woman testing boundaries isn't necessarily calculating or malicious. She's following deep psychological drives to find a partner strong enough to handle her. But when she finds a man who consistently fails to stand up for himself, it triggers disappointment rather than satisfaction. The testing escalates because failed tests don't produce the desired result. She unconsciously wants him to pass these tests by showing strength, setting limits, and demanding respect. When he doesn't, she increases the intensity, hoping to finally provoke the masculine response she's seeking. This creates a vicious cycle where her behavior becomes increasingly unreasonable, while his tolerance becomes increasingly unhealthy. The patient man misinterprets these tests as requests for more patience, more understanding, more accommodation. He believes that if he just gives a little more, tries a little harder, shows a little more love, she'll finally be satisfied. But satisfaction was never the goal. The goal was to find his limits and discover whether he has the strength to maintain them. This dynamic poisons the relationship because it creates a pursuer-distancer pattern. The more he accommodates her testing, the more she loses respect for him. The more she loses respect, the more she tests. The more she tests, the more he accommodates. Neither person gets what they actually want from the relationship. The man begins to feel increasingly frustrated and confused because his strategy of infinite patience isn't producing the love and appreciation he expected. Instead, he finds himself facing increasing demands, decreasing respect, and a partner who seems increasingly dissatisfied despite his efforts to please her. Women often don't consciously recognize their own testing behavior, which makes it particularly dangerous. They experience it as legitimate dissatisfaction rather than as boundary testing. This unconscious nature of the behavior makes it nearly impossible to address directly without triggering defensive responses. The solution requires understanding that these tests are actually opportunities. Each test is a chance to demonstrate strength, establish boundaries, and show that he values himself enough to demand respect. The woman who tests boundaries is often hoping to find them, not hoping to eliminate them entirely. When a man finally starts passing these tests by calmly but firmly maintaining his standards, the dynamic often shifts dramatically toward mutual respect. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. 3. The Guilt Trap. How emotional manipulation transforms patient men. The guilt trap represents one of the most insidious forms of psychological poisoning that patient men face in relationships. This mechanism works by weaponizing a man's natural desire to be good, caring, and responsible, turning these virtues against him in ways that slowly erode his mental stability and self-worth. Jung recognized that guilt operates differently in men and women due to fundamental psychological structures. Men typically experience guilt as a call to action. They feel compelled to fix, solve, or make amends when they believe they've done something wrong. Women often understand this male response intuitively and can exploit it to gain control over situations and outcomes. The process begins when normal relationship conflicts are reframed as moral failures on the man's part. Instead of discussing practical problems or differences of opinion, every issue becomes evidence of his inadequacy as a partner, his selfishness, or his failure to truly love her. This transforms ordinary relationship negotiations into moral judgments, where he's always found guilty. A patient man facing this manipulation experiences a constant state of psychological confusion. He knows something feels wrong, but he can't identify what it is because the accusations often contain tiny grains of truth mixed with massive distortions. He did come home late from work, so maybe he is inconsiderate. He did forget to call, so maybe he doesn't care enough. He did want some time alone, so maybe he is selfish. This confusion creates what Jung called cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension between conflicting beliefs or perceptions. The man's instincts tell him the accusations are unfair, but his desire to be good makes him question those instincts. Over time, he begins to trust her version of reality more than his own perceptions. The manipulation becomes more sophisticated as it continues. Past mistakes are regularly brought up and recontextualized as patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. His motivations are interpreted in the worst possible light. His attempts to defend himself are treated as additional evidence of his moral failings. Every conversation becomes a courtroom where he's simultaneously the defendant, the evidence, and somehow always guilty. Patient men are particularly vulnerable to this because they genuinely want to be better partners. They're willing to examine their behavior, admit their mistakes, and work on improving themselves. But this willingness to self-reflect becomes a weapon used against them when someone chooses to exploit rather than appreciate it. The psychological damage accumulates slowly but steadily. The man begins to doubt his own judgment, question his motivations, and assume he must be at fault whenever conflict arises. He develops what Jung might call a guilt complex, an unconscious pattern where he automatically accepts responsibility for problems he didn't create and emotions he didn't cause. This constant state of assumed guilt creates chronic stress that affects every aspect of his life. He becomes hypervigilant about his behavior, constantly monitoring himself for potential mistakes or oversights that might trigger another guilt session. This hypervigilance is exhausting and prevents him from being authentic or relaxed in his own relationship. The poisonous effect extends beyond the relationship itself. Men caught in guilt traps often become less confident at work, more anxious in social situations, and generally more pessimistic about their worth as human beings. The poison spreads through their entire psychological system because guilt affects how they see themselves at the most fundamental level. What makes this particularly cruel is that the manipulation often intensifies when the man tries to address it directly. Attempts to point out unfair treatment are met with more guilt induction. Now he's being defensive, unsympathetic, or trying to avoid responsibility for his actions. The trap becomes self-reinforcing because any effort to escape it is used as evidence that escape is needed. Recovery requires understanding that guilt should be proportional to actual wrongdoing. Healthy guilt motivates positive change and then disappears once amends are made. Manipulative guilt is constant, disproportionate, and increases over time regardless of behavioral changes. Patient men must learn to distinguish between these types and refuse to accept guilt that isn't genuinely earned. The most important realization is that someone who truly loves you doesn't want you to feel constantly guilty about your existence. Love seeks to build up, not tear down. When guilt becomes a primary tool for managing relationship dynamics, the relationship has become psychologically abusive regardless of intentions. 4. The poison of comparison. Why she always mentions other men. The strategic mention of other men in conversation represents one of the most effective psychological weapons used against patient men. This behavior operates on multiple levels simultaneously, triggering evolutionary insecurities while appearing innocent enough to dismiss any complaints as jealousy or insecurity. Jung understood that human psychology still carries ancient programming related to mate competition and sexual selection. When a woman consistently brings up other men in conversation, she's activating primal fears about being replaced, outcompeted, or found inadequate. This isn't accidental. It's often an unconscious strategy to maintain psychological leverage in the relationship. The poison works because it creates a constant state of subtle anxiety in the man's mind. He finds himself involuntarily comparing himself to these other men, wondering if he measures up, questioning whether she finds him as attractive, successful, or interesting as these alternatives she keeps mentioning. This mental activity happens automatically and consumes psychological energy that could be used for more productive purposes. Patient men are especially vulnerable because they try to be reasonable about these comparisons. They tell themselves they shouldn't feel threatened, that she's just making conversation, that jealousy is an ugly emotion they should overcome. But this rational approach ignores the fact that the behavior is triggering deep psychological responses that exist below conscious awareness. The mentions usually follow predictable patterns that maximize their psychological impact. She might praise other men's achievements right after he's experienced a setback at work. She'll comment on other men's attractiveness when he's feeling insecure about his appearance. She'll mention how thoughtful other husbands are when she wants him to do something specific. The timing isn't coincidental. Sometimes the comparisons are direct and obvious, but more often they're subtle and deniable. She'll talk about how successful her friend's boyfriend is, how romantic her sister's husband can be, or how funny that guy at work is. Each mention plants a seed of doubt about whether she's truly satisfied with what she has. The psychological mechanism behind this behavior often involves what Jung called projection. When women feel insecure about their own desirability or the stability of their relationship, they sometimes unconsciously try to transfer that insecurity to their partner. Making him worry about competition serves to balance the emotional scales in their internal world. Patient men typically respond by trying harder to prove their worth rather than addressing the behavior directly. They work longer hours to be more successful, plan more romantic gestures, or try to be funnier and more entertaining. But this response actually reinforces the behavior because it demonstrates that the strategy is working to motivate desired changes. The poison accumulates because the man never feels quite good enough. No matter how much he improves or achieves, there's always another comparison waiting to remind him that someone else might be doing it better. This creates a chronic sense of inadequacy that undermines his confidence and self-worth over time. What makes this particularly damaging is that the behavior often increases when the relationship is actually going well. When a patient man becomes more confident, successful, or attractive, the mentions of other men might intensify as an unconscious way to keep him working for approval rather than expecting it as his due. The most insidious aspect is how this behavior affects the man's perception of his partner's loyalty and satisfaction. He begins to wonder if she's always evaluating alternatives, if she's truly committed to the relationship, or if she's preparing him for eventual replacement. These doubts create emotional distance, even when the relationship might otherwise be strong. Jung would recognize this as a form of psychological warfare that undermines pair bonding. Healthy relationships create an us-against-the-world mentality where partners feel secure in their mutual choice. Constant comparisons to others destroy this security and create an environment where the relationship feels conditional and fragile. Breaking free requires recognizing that secure, satisfied women don't need to frequently mention other men's superior qualities. When this behavior is chronic, it reveals insecurity, manipulation, or dissatisfaction that needs to be addressed directly rather than accommodated through increased effort to compete with phantom rivals. 5. Disguised emotional blackmail, the tricks that awaken male fury. Emotional blackmail disguised as legitimate communication represents perhaps the most sophisticated form of psychological manipulation that patient men encounter. This technique operates by packaging threats, ultimatums, and manipulative demands within seemingly reasonable requests or emotional expressions, making it nearly impossible for the victim to identify or address the manipulation without appearing unreasonable themselves. Jung understood that humans have natural protective mechanisms against direct threats and obvious manipulation. When someone clearly states an ultimatum or makes an obvious threat, our psychological defenses activate immediately. But disguised emotional blackmail bypasses these defenses by wrapping manipulative content in language that appears caring, concerned, or emotionally vulnerable. The technique works by creating artificial crises that require immediate responses from the man. She might say she feels unloved when he spends time with friends, creating a false choice between his social connections and her emotional well-being. She might express fear about their future together whenever he makes independent decisions, forcing him to choose between autonomy and relationship security. Patient men fall into these traps because they genuinely care about their partner's emotional state and want to be responsive to legitimate needs. They don't recognize that the emotional distress is often artificially created or dramatically amplified to achieve specific behavioral changes. Their empathy becomes the weapon used against them. The blackmail often centers around withdrawal of affection, intimacy, or approval as consequences for unwanted behavior. But instead of stating this directly, it's presented as natural emotional responses to his actions. If he doesn't comply with her wishes, she doesn't threaten to withdraw love. She simply becomes sad, distant, or claims to feel disconnected from him. This creates what Jung might call a double bind, a psychological trap where every response leads to negative consequences. If the man complies with the emotional manipulation, he sacrifices his autonomy and self-respect. If he resists, he faces emotional consequences and accusations of being insensitive to her feelings. Either choice leads to psychological damage. The disguised nature of this blackmail makes it particularly poisonous because the man can't address it directly without being accused of not caring about her emotions. When he tries to point out the manipulative pattern, she can honestly claim that she was just expressing her feelings. This gaslighting effect makes him question his own perceptions and judgment. Over time, the patient man develops what might be called emotional hypervigilance, a constant state of monitoring his partner's emotional temperature and adjusting his behavior to prevent emotional storms. This is exhausting and prevents him from being authentic or spontaneous in his own relationship. The manipulation often escalates during important moments in the man's life. When he receives a promotion, she might become inexplicably sad about how work is changing him. When he wants to visit family, she might develop concerns about how his relatives treat her. When he pursues personal interests, she might feel neglected and unloved. The timing isn't accidental. Jung recognized that this type of manipulation creates deep resentment because it attacks the victim's ability to trust their own judgment and emotional responses. The man begins to doubt whether his partner's emotions are genuine or manufactured for effect. This doubt poisons intimacy because authentic connection requires trust in each other's honesty. The fury that eventually emerges isn't just anger at specific incidents, it's rage at being systematically deceived and manipulated while being told he's the problem for noticing the patterns. It's anger at having his empathy weaponized against him and his kindness treated as weakness to be exploited. What makes this particularly damaging is how it affects the man's relationship with his own emotions. He becomes disconnected from his natural responses because he's constantly questioning whether his feelings are valid or whether he's being selfish and insensitive. This emotional confusion creates psychological instability that extends far beyond the relationship. The blackmail often includes elements of victimization, where the woman presents herself as suffering due to his behavior, choices, or even his emotional responses. This creates guilt that reinforces compliance while making resistance appear cruel and heartless. The patient man finds himself apologizing for having needs, wants, or boundaries. Recognition requires understanding that legitimate emotional communication doesn't consistently result in the same person sacrificing their needs and autonomy. When emotional expressions always lead to behavioral changes in the same direction, they've likely crossed from communication into manipulation. Healthy relationships involve mutual accommodation, not unilateral surrender disguised as love. 6. The War of Silences, how ignoring destroys the soul of a patient man. The silent treatment represents one of the most psychologically devastating weapons that can be deployed against patient men. This form of emotional warfare operates by withdrawing the basic human need for acknowledgement and connection, creating a psychological void that gradually erodes the victim's sense of reality, worth, and sanity. Jung recognized silence as a powerful communicative force that could be more damaging than words. When someone refuses to acknowledge another person's existence through speech, eye contact, or basic human recognition, they're essentially communicating that the person doesn't exist or matter. This attacks the fundamental human need to be seen and validated by those we love. The technique is particularly effective against patient men because they typically respond to conflict with attempts to discuss, resolve, and understand problems. When faced with complete silence, their natural problem-solving instincts are rendered useless. They can't negotiate with silence, reason with absence, or resolve issues that aren't acknowledged to exist. Patient men often make the mistake of believing that silence indicates they should try harder to repair whatever damage they've caused. They increase their efforts to be loving, helpful, and attentive, hoping to earn their way back into communication. But this response often reinforces the effectiveness of the silent treatment as a control mechanism. The psychological damage occurs because silence creates information vacuum that the mind tries to fill. Without feedback or communication, the man begins to create stories about what's happening, why it's happening, and what it means about him as a person. These internal narratives are usually far more damaging than whatever actual problem triggered the silence. Jung understood that humans are meaning-making creatures who can't tolerate ambiguity for extended periods. When faced with silence, the mind begins generating explanations, and these explanations typically center around personal inadequacy, failure, and unworthiness. The silent treatment becomes a form of psychological torture that the victim inflicts upon himself. The war aspect emerges because silence isn't just absence of communication. It's active rejection of the other person's humanity. It's a statement that they don't deserve basic acknowledgement or courtesy. This rejection triggers deep psychological wounds related to abandonment, rejection, and social exclusion that activate ancient survival fears. Patient men are especially vulnerable because they often have higher than average needs for harmony and connection in relationships. They may have grown up in households where conflict was scary or destructive, making them particularly sensitive to signs that relationships are in danger. The silent treatment triggers all of these fears simultaneously. The poison works slowly but steadily, creating cumulative damage that affects the man's ability to trust his own worth and lovability. Each episode of silence reinforces the message that he's disposable, that his presence is optional, and that love can be withdrawn without warning or explanation. This creates chronic anxiety about relationship security. The silence often follows patterns that maximize psychological impact. It might begin after moments of particular intimacy or connection, creating confusion about what triggered the withdrawal. It might intensify when the man tries to address other relationship issues, effectively shutting down any possibility of healthy communication or problem resolution. What makes this particularly cruel is how it affects the man's sense of reality. He knows that problems exist and need discussion, but he's faced with someone who acts as if nothing is wrong while simultaneously punishing him through absence. This creates cognitive dissonance that can literally make him question his sanity and perception of events. The patient man often finds himself walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring his behavior and words to prevent triggering another silent treatment. This hypervigilance is exhausting and prevents authentic self-expression. He becomes a performer in his own relationship, constantly trying to maintain a character that won't trigger withdrawal. Jung would recognize this as a form of psychological warfare that attacks the victim's basic sense of belonging and acceptance. Humans are social creatures who need acknowledgement and interaction to maintain psychological health. When these needs are consistently weaponized, the damage can be profound and lasting. The fury that eventually emerges isn't just anger at being ignored. It's rage at being systematically dehumanized while being expected to continue functioning normally. It's anger at having basic human needs treated as privileges that can be withdrawn at will. The explosion often comes not from the current silence, but from the accumulated weight of all previous silences and the realization of how much dignity has been sacrificed in pursuit of reconnection. Recovery requires understanding that healthy relationships don't use silence as punishment, or communication doesn't get withdrawn as a form of control. When silence becomes a weapon, the relationship has crossed into psychological abuse territory, regardless of other factors or justifications. 7. The vicious cycle. When she punishes. Exactly what she most desires. The most psychologically devastating pattern that patient men encounter involves being punished for displaying the very qualities that initially attracted their partner and that she claims to want most in the relationship. This creates a maddening psychological maze where success becomes failure, virtue becomes vice, and the man's attempts to be a better partner are met with increasing dissatisfaction and criticism. Jung recognized this as a manifestation of what he called the anima projection, when women project their own internal masculine ideals onto their partners and then become frustrated when reality doesn't match their unconscious fantasies. The woman simultaneously craves and resents the very qualities she claims to desire most, creating impossible situations for the men who try to please her. The cycle typically begins after the honeymoon phase, when the woman has secured the relationship and begins unconsciously testing whether the man's positive qualities are genuine or performative. She starts punishing behaviors that initially attracted her to see if he'll maintain them under pressure or abandon them to avoid conflict. If he showed leadership qualities during courtship, she begins challenging every decision he makes and questioning his judgment. If he was protective and caring, she accuses him of being controlling and possessive. If he was romantic and attentive, she claims he's too needy or trying too hard. The very behaviors that won her heart become sources of complaint and criticism. Patient men fall into this trap because they genuinely want to address their partner's concerns and improve the relationship. When she complains about his leadership, he becomes more consultative. When she objects to his protectiveness, he gives her more space. When she criticizes his romantic gestures, he tones them down. But each accommodation leads to new complaints about the opposite behavior. This creates what Jung might call a psychological double bind, where the man cannot win regardless of his choices. If he leads, he's controlling. If he doesn't lead, he's weak. If he's protective, he's possessive. If he's not protective, he doesn't care. If he's romantic, he's needy. If he's not romantic, he's cold. Every path leads to criticism and dissatisfaction. The poison works because it attacks the man's ability to trust his own instincts and natural responses. He begins second-guessing every action, wondering if kindness will be seen as weakness, if strength will be seen as aggression, if care will be seen as control. This constant self-monitoring prevents authentic self-expression and creates chronic anxiety. What makes this particularly cruel is that the woman often doesn't consciously recognize her own contradictory demands. She genuinely feels frustrated when he displays the qualities she claims to dislike, but she also feels disappointed when he stops displaying them. This unconscious nature makes the pattern nearly impossible to address through direct communication. The cycle intensifies because the man's confusion and frustration begin affecting his natural confidence and masculine presence. As he becomes more uncertain and reactive, she loses attraction to the very person she helped create through her contradictory feedback. This loss of attraction leads to increased criticism, which creates more uncertainty, which reduces attraction further. Jung understood that this pattern often stems from women's unconscious conflicts about their own desires for masculine strength versus their conscious beliefs about equality and independence. They want a strong man, but feel guilty about wanting strength. They crave leadership but resist being led. They desire protection but reject anything that suggests they need protecting. The patient man begins experiencing what might be called behavioral paralysis, an inability to act naturally because every action has previously resulted in criticism. He becomes hypervigilant about his partner's reactions, constantly adjusting his behavior based on her mood rather than his own authentic responses. This makes him less attractive and more frustrating to be around. The fury that eventually emerges isn't just anger at specific criticisms, it's rage at being systematically driven insane through contradictory demands. It's the accumulated frustration of years spent trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle where the rules change every time he thinks he understands them. The explosion often comes when he realizes that no amount of accommodation will ever be enough. This pattern destroys relationships because it prevents the man from being authentic and the woman from respecting him. She can't respect someone who constantly changes himself based on her feedback, but she also can't stop giving feedback about behaviors that trigger her unconscious conflicts. Neither person gets what they actually want from the relationship. The psychological damage extends beyond the relationship because the man begins doubting his own judgment in all areas of life. If his natural instincts about relationships are consistently wrong, maybe his judgment about work, friendships, and personal goals is also flawed. This self-doubt can affect every aspect of his life and decision-making. Recovery requires understanding that someone who truly loves you doesn't want you to be a constantly shifting version of yourself based on their changing moods. Healthy relationships celebrate and encourage authentic self-expression, not punish it through contradictory demands and impossible standards. 8. Breaking free from the shadow. How to stop this destructive pattern forever. The liberation from these destructive patterns requires a fundamental shift in understanding that goes beyond simple behavioral changes. Jung believed that true healing happens when we integrate our shadow rather than continuing to suppress it. And for patient men, this means learning to honor their authentic responses while maintaining their genuine desire to love and be loved. The first step involves recognizing that patience without boundaries isn't virtue, it's self-abandonment disguised as love. True patience comes from a place of strength and choice, not from fear of conflict or desperate need for approval. When patience becomes compulsive rather than conscious, it transforms from a positive quality into a psychological weakness that invites exploitation. Men must learn to distinguish between healthy accommodation and unhealthy self-sacrifice. Healthy relationships involve mutual adjustment, where both partners occasionally stretch beyond their comfort zones for each other's benefit. Unhealthy relationships involve one person consistently abandoning their needs, boundaries, and authentic responses to maintain artificial peace. The integration of shadow doesn't mean becoming angry, aggressive, or uncaring. Instead, it means developing what Jung called conscious masculinity, the ability to access strength, assertiveness, and protective instincts when they're needed while maintaining genuine care and consideration for others. This integration creates inner stability that can't be easily manipulated or destabilized. Practical integration begins with learning to recognize and honor emotional signals before they become explosive. Irritation, frustration, and anger are information systems that indicate when boundaries are being crossed or needs are being ignored. Patient men must learn to address these signals early through calm but firm communication, rather than suppressing them until they become unmanageable. Setting and maintaining boundaries becomes a crucial skill that requires practice and commitment. Boundaries aren't walls built in anger. They're loving limits that protect both partners from destructive patterns. When a patient man learns to say no, calmly but firmly, he's not being mean or selfish. He's being responsible for his own psychological health and the health of the relationship. The process requires developing what might be called integrated strength, the ability to be simultaneously soft and strong, caring and assertive, loving and self-protective. This isn't contradictory, but complementary, like a tree that bends in the wind, but doesn't break because its roots are deep and strong. Men must also learn to recognize and address manipulation without becoming manipulative themselves. This means calling out problematic behaviors directly and calmly, rather than responding with passive aggression, silent treatment, or emotional withdrawal. Clear, honest communication about unacceptable behaviors protects both partners from escalating dysfunction. The healing process often involves grieving the loss of the good guy identity that made them vulnerable to exploitation. Many patient men have built their entire self-worth around being accommodating, understanding, and endlessly tolerant. Learning that these qualities can be toxic when taken to extremes requires rebuilding their sense of self around more balanced characteristics. Developing emotional intelligence becomes crucial for recognizing manipulative patterns before they become entrenched. This means learning to trust instincts when something feels wrong, even if the behavior appears reasonable on the surface. The gut often recognizes manipulation before the mind can analyze and understand it intellectually. The transformation requires understanding that healthy women actually want men with boundaries, strength, and self-respect. Women who are attracted to endless accommodation and self-sacrifice often have their own psychological issues that make them incompatible with healthy relationships. Attracting mentally healthy partners requires being mentally healthy yourself. Jung emphasized that shadow integration is ultimately about becoming whole rather than just being good. Wholeness includes the capacity for both tenderness and strength, both patience and assertiveness, both love and appropriate anger. Men who integrate these qualities become more attractive, respected, and genuinely loving partners. The liberation process involves recognizing that you can't love someone into mental health, and you can't sacrifice yourself into a healthy relationship. True love sometimes requires disappointing people, setting limits, and refusing to enable destructive behaviors. This isn't cruelty. It's the kind of tough love that actually creates positive change. Finally, breaking free means accepting that some relationships simply aren't salvageable once destructive patterns become entrenched. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both yourself and your partner is to refuse to participate in mutual destruction. This recognition takes tremendous courage, but often leads to the possibility of genuinely healthy relationships in the future. The goal isn't to become hard, cold, or defensive, but to become authentically strong in ways that serve both love and truth. When patient men learn to integrate their shadow consciously, they become capable of the kind of mature love that builds rather than destroys, that challenges rather than enables, and that creates genuine intimacy rather than toxic dependency. The greatest tragedy isn't that patient men become angry, it's that they were taught to believe their anger was always wrong, their boundaries were selfish, and their need for respect was optional. Jung understood that the shadow doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It simply grows stronger in the darkness until it can no longer be contained. Every good man who explodes in fury isn't revealing his true nature. He's showing the inevitable result of years of psychological poison that could have been prevented if he had learned to honor his authentic responses from the beginning. The path forward isn't about becoming less loving or more aggressive. It's about becoming whole enough to love from strength rather than fear, to give from abundance rather than desperation, and to recognize that the deepest form of respect you can show someone is refusing to let them destroy you while calling it love.